This is Justin Derby of Wildcat Spread 40 bringing you the Week 6 predictions for the Northwest Conference. Week 5 was a real doozy for the conference. Linfield had a dramatic come-from-behind win over Pacific Lutheran. Whitworth survived a close call with Pacific 28-25. Willamette came back in the fourth quarter to beat Sewanee 28-24, and Lewis and Clark beat Puget Sound in a shootout 55-42. With all that excitement, however, the bottom line is that the undefeated teams in the Northwest Conference from entering Week 5 did not change, and entering Week 6 remain the same. And with that, let's get to the games. First up on the agenda, we have Pacific at Puget Sound. Pacific is 1-3 on the season, while Puget Sound is a magnificent 0-4. Pacific seems to have the advantage in this one. They beat Occidental 27-6 earlier in the season, and Occidental is a traditionally good program in Division III. And they had a very close call with Whitworth last week, losing only 28-25. Puget Sound lost in a shootout to Lewis and Clark 55-42 last week, and while their offense had their best game of the season, their shoddy defense continued to be shoddy. So, because of Pacific's quality win and quality close loss, and UPS's complete lack of defense, I'm taking Pacific to win this matchup against Puget Sound on Saturday. And because I couldn't make a decision as to which game would be more important or bigger, there are two games of the week this week for the Northwest Conference. The first one of which is Willamette versus Whitworth. Willamette 4-0 on the season, looking brilliant all the way, while Whitworth is 5-0 on the season, living up to the expectations that many had for them to be a Northwest Conference title contender this season. However, when we break it down, things aren't quite so rosy for Whitworth. Whitworth, despite having arguably the best collection of skill players in the conference beside Linfield, at least that was the consensus entering the season, they have not quite lived up to those expectations. Although they are averaging 33 points per game, which is almost 6 points per game higher than last season, it ranks only 4th in the Northwest Conference. And they average just under 380 yards per game on offense, which is 6th in the conference, ahead of only Pacific. Whitworth, offensively, you know they're capable of exploding on people, but for some reason they just have a really hard time putting up the numbers on a consistent basis. And they have a hard time putting up the amount of points that they should be putting up. And their close win over Pacific last week is a great area of concern. While Pacific is definitely showing strides of becoming a more competitive football team in 2012, Whitworth, if they were really a Northwest Conference title contender, should have been able to thrash them pretty soundly, like Willamette did not too long ago. Willamette entering the game is coming off that grueling overtime fourth quarter comeback win over Sewanee. The Willamette offense is as explosive as I've seen in a long time in the conference. Averaging a shade under 44 points a game and 528 yards, the Willamette offense is #1 in the conference in just about every statistic. And on defense, Willamette is #1 in the conference in turnovers force, 18 in 4 games. So, because Whitworth's offense hasn't been quite living up to expectations, and both defenses really about the same, plus Willamette has the #1 offense, in a game that really could go either way and I'd not be surprised by Whitworth winning, I'm going to take Willamette to win this one. And the other game of the week for the Northwest Conference in Week 6 is Pacific Lutheran at Lewis and Clark. PLU is 1-2 on the season, and they are fresh off of a tough 31-24 loss to Linfield last week. Lewis and Clark is 4-0 on the season, and coming off of a 55-42 shootout win over Puget Sound in Week 5. For this game, there's a lot going into it for Lewis and Clark, and this should be a game that will tell us exactly how good they really are. However, let's take a look back at last week when Lewis and Clark put up some astounding numbers on Puget Sound. Lewis and Clark's offense started getting back on track in the game before against McAlester, and they really steamrolled Puget Sound's horrible defense, which they rightfully should have. For the game, Lewis and Clark had 610 yards of offense, and they finally got their ground game established as they racked up 285 yards rushing for the game against Puget Sound's shoddy run defense. For the game, Keith Welch was sensational, going 24-42 for 325 yards, 4 touchdowns and an interception, as well as carrying the ball 20 times for 42 yards and another 3 touchdowns on the ground. 7 touchdowns in one game by one player is pretty impressive. But perhaps more impressive for Lewis and Clark, and despite the fact that Lewis and Clark's own athletic department doesn't want to emphasize his performance at all, running back Curtis Shirey had a monster game against Puget Sound, racking up 212 yards and a touchdown on 21 carries on the ground. In the last 2 games combined, Curtis Shirey has 38 carries for 299 yards and 2 touchdowns, an astounding 7.9 yards per carry. Seems like the Lewis and Clark running game, my bad, is getting completely on track now. And the offense, as of now, just seems to be steamrolling. Keith Welch on the season, while not quite as strong of a runner as he has been in past years, is putting up a monster season so far passing the ball, completing over 61% of his passes for 1,091 yards of 10 touchdowns and only 1 interception in 4 games. The Lewis and Clark offense on the season right now is number 2 in the Northwest Conference in both scoring at 38.5 points a game and yards of offense per game at 437.5 yards. Lewis and Clark seems to be on a roll offensively and hopefully can do that against PLU's tough defense on Saturday. One area of concern though for for Lewis and Clark is the defense. For the first 3 games, Lewis and Clark, by a wide margin, was the number 1 defense in the Northwest Conference in both points and yards allowed per game. However, against Puget Sound, the worst team in the conference, arguably, or easily I should say, Lewis and Clark's defense was not very good. Gave up 480 yards of offense, including about 330 through the air, letting Adam Niffen have a monster day, and the 42 points allowed. When you're the number 1 defense in your conference, no matter who you are in this Northwest Conference, you should not be giving up nearly 500 yards and 40 points to the worst team in the league. That is a great, while the stats for Lewis and Clark's defense are still pretty good, number 1 in yards allowed, number 2 in points allowed, that game against Puget Sound is not a good sign for Lewis and Clark's defense, as they have yet to face the better teams in the conference. And in terms of being exposed through the air, Pacific Lutheran does exactly that, as they are one of the premier passing teams in the Northwest Conference, averaging 314 yards per game through the air on the season. Richie Dalton completing 57% of his passes for 918 yards of 5 touchdowns and 3 interceptions. The real gem of PLU's passing attack is their 2 wide receivers. Kel Westering with 19 receptions for 349 yards and 2 touchdowns, an astonishing 18.4 yards per reception. And Kyle Warner, who has 14 receptions for 270 yards and 2 scores on the season, which is an astounding 19.3 yards per reception. 2 really explosive receivers, a quarterback who can gunsling the ball around. If Puget Sound was able to throw the ball on Lewis and Clark's defense all day, you would think that PLU would be able to put up similar numbers. So the real question is, will Lewis and Clark's defense rebound from their poor showing against Puget Sound and rise to the occasion against PLU's explosive passing attack? Or will they be exposed, forcing the Lewis and Clark offense to bail them out? I honestly don't know exactly what's going to happen in this game, as last year's game was a real close, tight one. But at this point, since I kind of picked Lewis and Clark to be 3rd in the conference, I'm taking Lewis and Clark at home to beat Pacific Lutheran. This is Justin Derby of Wildcats Spread 40, bringing you the Week 6 predictions for the Northwest Conference.